You know, I think there's a reason there's an anti-incumbent mentality out there. And it's it's what motivates me. I know it's motivating other folks too. We see that there's a crisis in our state with the pensions. We see there's a crisis with the debt at the federal level. And we see there's paralysis among our leaders. And I think a lot of them have also lost that sense of community service. And this reminds me of a story I want to tell you about a barber. He'd been in his community for like 30 years, and he decided that he wanted to do community service one week. So he just did free haircuts. And the first guy that walks into the barber shop, he gets his haircut. He's a florist. And he asked how much was the haircut cost. And he said, well, this haircut is free because I'm doing community service this week. And he's like, well, I run a business. You can't do free things. And he's like, but I've been here so long. It's, it's community. You understand, don't you? He said, sure. And this was the florist. So the next day when the barber came to work, there was a dozen roses waiting for him in his shop. So he felt pretty good about community service. Well, when the policeman walked in and gave him a free haircut, he explained to him he was doing community service, and since the policeman was a public servant, he got the idea. And the next morning there were a dozen donuts waiting on the barber. Well, then a congressman walks in and asks for a haircut, and he gives him a great haircut, and the congressman says, well, how much is this haircut? It's free. You're a public servant. You understand what I'm doing here, right? This is community service. You give something back. You serve the people. And the congressman says, yeah, I understand. So the next morning when the barber comes in, there's 12 congressmen waiting. And obviously, community service does not mean that the community serves you or that the public serves you. It means that you're going to serve the public. And that's what I want to go out there to do, is to serve the public. And I think a lot of our servants have lost track of the fact that they are servants. Now, my issues in the general election are going to be the same as they were in the primary. And I'd like to quote two different presidents to kind of frame these issues. The first president I want to quote is our president right now, Obama. He said that you didn't build that. Well, the regulators say, we're not going to let you build that. And the entrepreneurs are saying, we're not going to build that. Now, the second quote to frame my positions comes from Ronald Reagan, who's right here on our wall. He said that if it moves, they tax it. If it keeps moving, they regulate it. And when it stops moving, they'll subsidize it. And that's what's wrong with our country right now. There's too much taxes, too much regulation, and too many subsidies, whether they're earmarks, and some of them are tax marks, which I'll talk about later, spending in the tax code. But there's too much of that right now. We need to shrink the size of government. We need regulatory reform, we need tax reform, and we need to address our budget issues. Because this is going to, it's going to consume our country if we don't deal with this. And implicit in my platform, it's not really a fourth part of my platform, but it's implicit in everything, is that we're going to do this within a constitutional framework. One of my favorite senators is Jim DeMint, and he said that if Obama's slogan is, yes we can, the Constitution slogan is, no you can't. Because the Constitution is a list of things that the government can't do. It's, all of our rights are God-given and natural rights. The Constitution doesn't give those to us. The Constitution limits the government. And that's my concern with the president that we have right now, is that he doesn't see any limits there in the Constitution. But implicit in my platform is a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and that we're going to preserve all of our liberties as we go forward. One of my other favorite senators is Senator Tom Coburn. He's got a book out that I highly recommend. It's called The Debt Bomb. And he talks about, the subtitle here is A Bold Plan to Stop Washington from Bankrupting America. And what he talks about in here is the problem is not bipartisanship, because they can get together and decide what to spend money on. They just haven't got together and decided how to balance the budget. In fact, the problem in Washington is careerism. They get there and they try and figure out how to stay there. And so they'll vote for things to keep them there. He's got some phrases in here that I like. He talks about earmarks, and he calls them the gateway drug to spending for politicians. Because they're kind of a gateway drug to spending because they don't themselves constitute a large portion of the budget. But what they do is they reinforce that mentality that that's the reason that you're in Congress. You're there to get a piece of pork and send it home. Fortunately, right now we have a moratorium on earmarks, but he describes from the inside what's going on right now. They're tax marks, tax credits. It's spending in the tax code. And I know there are a lot of us that have signed the Grover Norquist pledge not to raise taxes. But there are a lot of spending in the tax code that frankly if you got rid of it, would not qualify as raising taxes. For instance, the ethanol subsidy. That's basically spending right there, government spending. It's government subsidies, it's central planning, it's basically Keynesian economics, and it all happens within the tax code. Didn't even have to have an earmark. Well, we got rid of that. And there was some debate where and there were some Republicans who had signed the tax pledge who were roundly chastised for doing away with ethanol subsidies. But it really is spending in the tax code. And we have to recognize that for what it is. And there are some other things. Even I think Mitt Romney has vowed that he's going to let the tax credits for windmills expire. And nobody's blaming him for raising taxes. So we have to look at this stuff, and if it quacks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. He said there's also now phone marks. These are like earmarks. He said when Congress decides they're going to give more money to one agency, they'll call up that agency first and say, now, you're going to spend this in my district on this thing, right, before I vote for this, right? So I think the right answer basically is to send people there that you can trust, that aren't going there to try and buy your vote for the next re-election. You need to send people to Congress that are concerned about our debt. Speaking of which, does anybody remember the Simpson-Bowles Act and the Simpson-Bowles Committee in 2010? How the president was going to get this bipartisan group. We were going to solve the nation's debt problem, the spending problem, and the entitlement reform. What happened to Simpson-Bowles? Just kind of faded off. And then you remember last year, they had to raise the debt ceiling, and there was a big brouhaha, what are we going to do? And the conservatives didn't want to do it, and the liberals wanted tax increases, and they had this compromise, this great compromise. They appointed a super committee. Does anybody remember the super committee? Okay, so the first problem with the super committee is we already have a super committee. It's called Congress. All right, so I don't know how you make a committee that's any super than Congress, but they put together the super committee, and they decided, oh, this is just way too political. There's hand-wringing. We can't make these decisions ourselves. We'll get voted out. So they pushed it off to the super committee. And the super committee came up with some really good ideas. And Tom Coburn was the author of a bunch of those ideas. And the problem was it got demagogued. Like the left demagogued the ideas and the right demagogued the ideas. And nothing happened. So now what are we facing? And this is of extreme interest to me right now because they kicked the can down the road, and I'm about to go in the arena where the can sits. In fact, I may get there sooner since Jeff Davis has resigned, the seat's opened up, and there may be a special election on November 6th, which if things went well and if I were won both the special and the general election, I would be in Congress presumably as early as November 7th, voting in a lame duck session where the cans pile up that they kick down the road. And there could be a lot of votes going on then. And one of the votes is going to be on the residual of that whole Simpson-Bowles super committee, all those cans that just got kicked down the road. I don't know why they came up with this name, but they call it sequestration. And what this sequestration is, it's basically automatic cuts that are going to kick in. They're going to kick in on January 2nd. The new Congress takes office on January 3rd. But these sequestration cuts kick in a day or two before that. And it's across the board. Some people have likened it to taking a lawnmower to your flower bed to cut the weeds. I mean, there's no discrimination. Everything's going to get trimmed. Now, to be fair, they've taken off of the table Social Security. That won't be affected. They've taken off veterans pay, military pay. That won't be affected. They've taken food stamps off the table. Well, once you take, and those are some big pieces of the pie that they've taken off the table. So what's left is defense spending and a little bit of domestic spending, once you take all that off the table. So half of these cuts that they're going to make are going to come out of defense, and half of them are going to come out of domestic spending. And the Republicans are howling bloody murder, and the Democrats are howling bloody murder, because the cuts that they all voted for are about to happen.